Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras A Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. On the program, we discuss a new book that looks at decolonization theory and the history of civil rights and liberties through philosophy and legal theory. Joining us is Dr. Mark Lusk, Assistant Professor of Social Work at NMSU. Dr. Lusk is a former Fulbright Scholar and Professor Emeritus of Social Work at UTEP. He has worked in many countries around the world on development projects. His research is focused on street children, forced migrants, refugees, resilience, and human rights. He joins us now to talk about his new book, Decolonized Approaches to Human Rights and Social Work, a book that you edited with others. Dr. Lusk, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Can you give us an understanding, really, just about the need for this book today?
Yes, there has been a fairly large literature in the last few decades on the evolution of human rights and human rights theory, but there hasn't been much attention to the intersection between human rights and decolonization, which is a more contemporary theoretical orientation that social science and law and political science use to look at the way in which the Western perspective, that of primarily Western Europe, the United States, North America, has dominated the discussion, the dialogue, and the understanding of what's happening in the global South. And also within the interior regions of Europe and the United States where there are colonized spaces. So this book was aimed at addressing that intersection between human rights and decolonization, and also pulling in my profession, which is the profession of social work, which is a profession that dedicates itself to the resolution of social problems through social science, through evidence-based practice. And so this tradition of decolonization, tied with the tradition of human rights, gives us a theoretical practice or perspective to inform our practice.
Now, you've worked in 60 countries at least on different development projects. Can you kind of give us a little bit more about your background and what places around the world you've worked in?
My interest in international work grew out of the fact that my dad was a foreign service officer. He was a diplomat who was primarily stationed during his career in South America, and I grew up in South America. I did my primary school in Paraguay, and I did prepa and preparatoria in Bogota, Colombia, and graduated from there. And actually came to New Mexico State because I wanted to go to a college in the United States that had a significant presence of people of Latin American ancestry, because that's the context in which I grew up. And that childhood experience exposed me to a range of issues that really raised my awareness and consciousness of the global nature of all problems. They're all interrelated. The poverty of a person in Paraguay is not unrelated to the poverty of a person in Mexico, and that there are underlying structures that help explain that. And so as a result of that, I studied, and after my doctorate, began to work as a contractor for the U.S. Agency for International Development. My first project was in Tanzania, in East Africa, working on an agriculture education project. That led into some postdoc work in agriculture engineering, and then that led me to South Asia, Central Asia, and another set of countries working for the World Bank as a contractor, Inter-American Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, and of course the United States Agency for International Development. All of those experiences were extremely enriching. I was privileged to have the opportunity to work in the global South and to see things close up and in person.
This book brings together folks in social work from around the world. Can you kind of give us an understanding of just how international this book really is?
Yes. I had a stint as the North American Commissioner for Human Rights of the International Federation of Social Workers. It's the global association of social workers, and it encompasses 90 countries that are member nations. The United States is a member nation, and I represented the North American region. In the context of that, I got to know a lot of commissioners around the world who were working on human rights issues, and as a result of that, began to make contacts with writers in India, South America, Asia, who were in a position to write about human rights and decolonization in their particular context. So my two co-editors are Melinda Madu from Germany. She teaches at the Protestant University of Ludwigsburg. And then my second collaborator is Marcin Borishko, who's a professor at the University of Gdansk, where the Solidarity movement started in Poland. And between us, we compiled the world's leading experts in decolonization and social work in that intersection that we were talking about. So the result is truly global. It doesn't have a North American perspective, doesn't have a European perspective, although that's the background of the editors, because there are contributors from all around the world.
Can you share with us some of the major challenges facing international social work these days?
Yeah, I think the main thing that faces social work when looked at from a global perspective, not say just within the United States or within New Mexico or the border region, but in a global perspective, is the vast disparities between the global north, which consists of Japan, affluent parts of East Asia, the European Union and the United States and Canada, and the global south, which excluding Australia and New Zealand includes all of the developing nations, where the conditions of life can be really scandalous in terms of the extent of poverty and injustice that pervades many of these countries. And the thesis of the book is that much of that inequality, the lack of access to justice in many of these regions, is a legacy of colonialism. And that even though right after World War II, when we established the United Nations internationally, and there was an independence movement among all of the colonies, the ones in Africa, South America, and South Asia, and so on, the legacy of colonialism still remained there, even though they were independent countries. And that legacy is still with us today in what we would call a neo-colonial form.
What about human rights, or the way we think about that, and how does social work make an impact in that? Can you share a little bit more about how we understand that today compared to perhaps decades ago?
Sure. Human rights as a term was not commonplace up until the Holocaust and World War II. And in the aftermath of the massive conflicts that pervaded Europe and of course Far East Asia, the pervasiveness of fascism and genocide, the United Nations convened under the leadership of the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt to establish the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. And that was 2 years of work. It involved over 50 nations, and they all got together and decided that we needed a common framework to understand the rights of individuals in the post-war society, that we could not risk going back to the awfulness and sheer horror of what had happened during that period. So the United Nations enacted that, and most countries, or most of the countries in the world, have signed on and ratified it as part of their own responsibility. Social work, which is much older than this, having been established in the 19th century, primarily in England and then later in the United States, began to look for frameworks. Human rights wasn't the framework that was then commonplace, but had been dedicated to the social dignity and inherent worth of all individuals, especially people who are poor and especially immigrants. And in cities like Chicago and New York, social workers dedicated to that, dedicated themselves to that. But looking for a theoretical perspective really came into focus when the Human Rights Declaration was ratified. And that's been sort of the bedrock perspective of our profession ever since that happened.
The book covers social work and the decolonization project. Can you share with us about some of the work that the authors are providing within that section?
Sure. Well, there are several chapters that address some of the challenges that we have today, say in Europe and in North America, around the rise of authoritarian nationalism. This is one of the great challenges that I think we're facing right now. You see it just in the news today. This week with the situation in Ukraine, which is an attempt by Russia to recolonize Europe. You see it in China with the effort to take control Tibet, which they have controlled now for decades, to take on Xinjiang, which is the Uyghur area of China. So these themes are very current, and the political politics of the time reflects this recolonization through a framework of authoritarian nationalism, the rise of the new right in Europe, the rise of the new right in the United States. That's one part of it. Another part of it is what I would call professional colonialism, and that is the prestige professions like psychology, medicine, nursing, and so on. Whether their prestige is inherited or deserved is one thing, but there's an extraordinary status that comes with that, and with it a certain arrogance in the way that professionals work with clients. And so I subsume that kind of professional arrogance into a concept of neocolonialism as well, is that we're treating our own citizens as if they're members of an internal colony, undeserving of full partnership with us as professionals. So we need to decolonize our own professions is another one of the lessons that we try to address in this book.
How do you address that today in the classroom for those folks venturing into the world of social work when they've had history courses and their own experiences to understand really this new approach within social work?
Well, at universities like New Mexico State University, which is extraordinarily diverse student body, everyone has experienced to some degree or knows someone who's experienced the kind of oppression that goes along with their identities, whatever those identities may be: gender expression, ethnicity, culture, religion, and ethnic background. And so they understand very quickly that colonialism and human rights affects them and the history that their families have gone through. It also is something that our state and other states have experienced as well. The film Oppenheimer, for instance, is particularly poignant at illustrating the downwind effects, the experiments that took place in the detonation of the first atomic weapon here. That it was to do that in New Mexico, it's as if you thought of this place as an uninhabited space, as empty and devoid of people and culture, when in fact this is one of the richest cultural regions of the United States, going back all the way through to its place on the Camino, the Paso del Norte region. So that too sort of represents a paternalism and a Eurocentrism, that somehow this area is uninhabited and doesn't count. Another example of it is up in the Four Corners in the Navajo region and the indigenous peoples of Utah, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico, who were decimated by uranium mining and some of the exploitation that took place there. So colonialism is not just something that happened in Uganda by the British, or in India as a result of the British, or in Cuba or the Philippines by the United States. It's happening within countries now. And I would argue, for instance, that the effort by the Putin regime to capture Ukraine and bring it back into the Russian Empire or the neo-Soviet Union is just another iteration of that same sort of phenomenon.
This book also aims to amplify voices from the Global South. Can you share with us exactly how it does that?
Well, one of the messages that we try to convey in social work, not only in our classrooms but in our practice and our research, is to give voice to the voiceless. And when the dialogue, when the media, when history is written by the victors, which are in the North and in Europe, it has been written through that lens, and there are legions of voices that are unheard, that at times, like the movement under Mahatma Gandhi and other key moments in history of the Global South, have been, a complete reconfiguration of that. And India today, as the largest democracy in the world, reflects that. But notwithstanding these pockets of discovery of the importance of the identities of decolonized and recolonized nations, the narrative has been written as if these places don't count, and it's been written by us in the global North. So that's part of the effort of social work, is to bring a balance into the dialogue so that we're informed by the indigenous cultures, by the global Southern cultures, and not practicing a profession that is purely embedded in a Eurocentric model.
What are your concerns, though, about the dialogue that we have going on today in our country and across the world about dealing with these issues, whether it's the what's happening in Ukraine or the refugee crisis that many countries are dealing with around the world? How do you approach that and try to find some understanding to where people are expanding the lens a little bit more?
Right. I think it's a setup, it's a false dichotomy that we've created, in which it's us against them, outsider versus insider, and a failure to recognize through a common frame such as human rights is that we're all in this together. And the notion, the fundamental idea behind social work, and also I think behind diplomacy, the political process of diplomacy, is acting in the interest of all parties concerned. And when it's unilateral, such as the invasion of the Ukraine, it's ultimately going to alienate everybody. And then this sets up a false dichotomy in American politics and European politics as to whose side we are on. Are we on the side of democracy, or are we on the side of isolationism? So I think we're at a perilous point in history right now, where the divisions between political ideologies has become so pronounced that we're failing to find common ground. And the European Union, the United States of America, these international treaties to which we're a member state, have been built on the vision that we're in this together and that we have to find common ground. And my dad was a diplomat, and his job was to find common ground. I'm a college professor. When I come into a class where there are contentious points of view and differences of opinion among my students, I try to find common ground. This is a dialogue that needs to be maintained openly and respectfully, and it seems like people are not being either as fair or as considerate of other people's opinions as has been the case in the past, so that civil discourse becomes the norm again. That's the issue that I think is really dividing us at this time.
How do you address social work's impact and our understanding of this as well? I think the book even talks about that, about social work being complicit in some of the colonization efforts that were going on. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yes, because we were a profession that was initially founded on principle of charity, doing good unto others as an act of goodness of our heart, and it reflected on our own goodness, which is really sort of a simplistic and naive way to look at how we should be doing our work. We were complicit in a lot of things. I'll give you an example. The Indian schools, American Indian schools, social workers and teachers separated families initially from their tribal groups and engaged essentially in a re-indoctrination and deracination of Native Americans. That experience in which we were complicit to some degree, some limited degree, is an example of how we have been part and parcel of the Eurocentric worldview, that this is a population that needs somehow to be subjugated and reconfigured. Those days have long since passed, and yet we've not done enough to learn from indigenous cultures about how they address the world, see the world, especially with respect to the importance of the earth, the environment, and that which sustains us all in the broadest sense, which has been lost in my profession because we've really looked at just humans and interacting with their human environment. And now the crisis that faces us, the hottest year in the history of recorded history, human history, it's right in front of us. Anybody who's not paying attention to it's just not paying attention. It's shocking the level of what we've done to the environment. So this is a part of the book too. We've brought in ecological rights as the next stage.
There are some parts of the book as well that try to bring some understanding to the U.S.-Mexico border. Yes. And what we've experienced here in our borderland. Can you share a little bit about how the book addresses that?
Yes, Dr. Nicolas Natividad here at the New Mexico State Department of Criminal Justice did a brilliant chapter on the human rights issues around migration, refugees, and forced migrants. And I think he illustrates how, as a human rights issue, this is one of our main concerns is how are we processing this? Are we going to be xenophobic? Are we going to be isolationistic? Or are we going to recognize the fundamental humanity of this population and attempt to find ways that conform to American law and also conform to our international obligations as signature to human rights conventions?
Where we're at right now in our understanding of the U.S.-Mexico border, it's going to be a topic in the upcoming presidential election and other elections. What are some things you think that can be helpful for those conversations for us to really understand, for a lot of folks, even who may not live here, to understand what's really happening here at the border?
Well, the simplest thing, I think, is to do what I've done a lot, and that is to accompany the migrant. I spent 12 years doing research with forced migrants and refugees and did a number of articles on that. But hearing their perspective and the repeated statement that many of them make, if not almost all of them make, that I had no choice but to leave. To not leave was untenable. My son was going to be conscripted into organized crime. My daughter was going to be conscripted into human trafficking. My husband was murdered. We lost our way of life. This isn't just economic migration, which has been ongoing for centuries and has been beneficial to both sides. This is human migration that's forced as a result of catastrophic conditions in the countries of origin. So we have to be thoughtful about their consideration. And also, how can migration benefit us in the way that it has historically? For many, this is seen as a downside, a negative. There's nothing positive about it. But just about everybody I know is a descendant of immigrants or an immigrant. And this has been an important part of the success of the American experiment. And I think we ought to continue with that. And it's been a long time. It was under President Reagan that we had the last comprehensive immigration reform. It's time for both sides of the aisle to get serious and start talking about this again.
Dr. Mark Lusk, Associate Professor of Social Work at NMSU, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you very much. It's an honor.
The book is Decolonized Approaches to Human Rights and Social Work, and it is available now. Moving on, a local writers group in Las Cruces works with members interested in strengthening their writing skills. Our producer, Christian Valle, shares more in this community connection.
The Las Cruces Writers Group. It's a group of people. We have 43 members right now. We talk about writing. We also have classes that we teach, and we have readings where people who want to have their work reviewed, that we will help them review their work. That's our main goals in this group.
On table in the living room, the radio is picking up a news broadcast mentioning the attempted assassination of James America.
It is a bunch of folks that are trying to proliferate the arts into the community themselves, because books, to be successful, have to be sold and read. And so if the community can't help us do that, if they don't buy our work, don't know about our work, and they don't know about this group, then it's harder to make our work come true, to make our dreams come true, selling books and getting our word out there of what we're trying to say. So without the community, authors are nothing.
Honestly, I hope I will get published this year. My strategy right now is to write short stories and edit short stories first, because it's a bit easier than doing whole novels. But also I feel like doing so would help, like once it comes to longer work novels, that it would help develop those skills before going ahead and doing something longer. Wanted to become a writer for a while, but the problem was I had trouble specifically when it came to editing, and I can see this when I go home and look on my computer. There'll just be a whole bunch of drafts but nothing edited, so I decided to find a group of people that could look over my work and help me improve my own writing. If you're just like interested in improving your writing, definitely look into it. When it comes to writers, there's a lot of people have ideas, but they don't share them, they don't have people look over their work, and that means there's a lot of writers out there that have specific ideas but just don't take really steps to get them out.
So the public can come and see what we're about, and if they want to join, they can join right then or later sometime if they'd like. You can contact Rosemary Mata, who's our Secretary Treasurer, who will take your money, membership fee, and you can join through her. Or you can go to the website, which is LasCrucesWritersGroup.org. One of the things we promise our writers is that we'll have book signings for them. So if an author has never been through a book signing before, they can join our organization and we will help them do that. We have 2 book signings a year. Right now they're held at the mall in the July timeframe and December timeframe do book signings. It's grown to 42 members now, and I think it'll continue to grow. So we would like to welcome any age, whether you're published or not, or even thinking about writing a book. We'd like to talk to you because we think we can help you.
That's it for our program this week. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget, you can stay updated on news and past episodes of Fronteras A Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time.